welcome to Comic Island. My name is Arden, and today we're talking about the top 10 Justice League stories. So today I'm trying out a new web camera. We'll see how well this one works. It's a bit of a technical issue getting it all set up, so by all means, if you have feedback, let me know. I'm sure I can fiddle around with things in the future to make it a little bit better, but for now, we're going to talk about the best Justice League stories ever written. This was a Patreon poll winner from a few weeks ago, one that I put up along with a few other top 10s that this one ended up winning. It's up here because with Scott Snyder starting on the Justice League, I thought it'd be interesting to look back at the greatest Justice League stories ever told. And that was it in terms of parameters for this list. And not really specifically looking at the comics, I considered just about everything, from the animated series in the 90s to even the movie. Now I've got to tell you, in spite of that, the comics won, but it's worth putting that into context. Pretty much 9 out of the 10 entries on this top 10 are comic books, and only one is technically an animated movie, but is a very close adaptation to its original comic book story. But that's just the way things worked. I really like the 90s animated series, yet it just doesn't really hold up to some of the best Justice League comics there ever really was. So yes, while we are focusing on Justice League stories here, it is really the best comics out there, and I tried to provide the best references in terms of what issues to look out for because a lot of these really are worth reading. So with that, enjoy. Know that there were a lot of competitors for this list. These top 10 really are some of the very best Justice League stories ever written. And as you might imagine, a lot of stuff that's very good and interesting had to go to the wayside. To that end, there's a bunch of honorable mentions that I'm going to be kind of bringing up throughout this video, but there's a few that I am not mentioning going forward that I'll bring up here. Scott Snyder's current Justice League run was a bit hard to judge since it's only in its early stages, but his big crossover event with Dark Knight's Metal was definitely considered for this top 10, as was a bunch of other stuff ranging from some of the other popular New 52 Justice League related events such as Forever Evil or the Dark Side War, both of which are pretty good and I did consider for this top 10 at one time or another, as well as big events that I considered beyond the scope of the Justice League. Take your Crisis of Infinite Earths, your Final Crisis, or your Infinite Crisis. Those stories to me involved concepts and characters bigger than the League itself. The stories we're talking about today very specifically focus on the Justice League and how they're involved in these stories and what's so great about them as a team together. So with that in mind, enjoy as we go through the all-time best Justice League stories ever made. This is a story about history and destiny and love and coming of age and friendship and passion. My name is John Smith, and this is the story of my life. Our first story hails from the Meltzer era. I am not exactly the biggest fan of Brian Meltzer or his attempt to modernize DC, largely because of the infamous Identity Crisis event. But this story kicks off a run I actually did quite enjoy on the whole and think it was a positive effect in bringing the DC universe into the modern age in a much more positive way when compared to, say, Identity Crisis. That's kind of what Meltzer was all about, and as a result, he starts off this new Justice League of America run with the Tornado's Path. It features a very awesome roster of Justice League characters. It's very unique, a lot of fun, and an excellent way to improve the diversity of the team with heroes that had thoroughly earned their spot on the team without relying on past rosters to inform which characters were put on the Justice League for this iteration. By the way, yes, for those wondering, I didn't really parse things out between Justice League of America titles versus, say, Justice League International or other series. If it involved the Justice League characters in some form or another, they are basically qualified for this top 10. Importantly, this team, while still different and unique in its own decision for which characters to feature, does keep the core trinity intact. And that's important for the overall setup and framework of this story, with the main 3 Justice League members picking out a new team, looking over the various options available to them, the relative strengths and weaknesses of different people, and discussing who they want on their Justice League. The art and launch behind this comic series is phenomenal. Though not the best in the world, it's a great visual experience overall as we watch a new team learn to work together and ultimately carve themselves a great moment in DC history. Meltzer does a really good job with selling us on this series going forward. I love the initial framework of this story where the Trinity is debating new members in a friendly way, considering characters like Nightwing and other allies that they've worked with in the past, before ultimately arriving on characters such as Vixen, Roy Harper, and Red Tornado. The art's not perfect. It can be a bit inconsistent from Ed Benes, especially when it comes to certain scenes where characters are showing off emotion, but he really nails action and big panels with epic moments that have a lot of posterity to them. Superpowers are also shown off to an incredible extent in creative and fun ways, featuring characters like Vixen and Red Tornado. Their powers are used in a fun way we don't often get to see, and that's an excellent selling point of this comic. It's really great seeing Roy Harper join the big leagues too. There's a real sense of him having earned this. Ollie thinks he's being picked up from the league when Green Lantern comes by, only for Hal to actually be there for Roy. Ollie is shocked, but ultimately just so proud of his one-time sidekick. It's great. As for Red Tornado, this story's focus, there's a lot of vision in all of this, we'll say, but a more sinister undertone while the man gets a second chance at life. There's some great twists that make it a classic Justice League story. I have to say there's a nice little moment that ties into the origin of the Justice League itself, and I think the story is pretty great as a whole because of little details like that. Overall, this is an excellent modern story about the Justice League, and a good way to still get excited about some characters outside of the typical wheelhouse of the Justice League, while still unquestionably being a DC story. It leaves you eager to keep going through the rest of the series and is chock full of great and wonderful moments. At the end of the day, it's hard to ask for anything else, and it's one of the best Justice League stories I've ever read. For want of a nail, the shoe was lost. For want of a shoe, the horse was lost. For want of a horse, the knight was lost. For want of a knight, the battle was lost. So it was a kingdom was lost, all for the want of a nail. It's not too surprising an Elseworlds story worked its way on this list since they are so prevalent in DC canon. Nor is it the only one on the top 10, even after stuff like Kingdom Come were excluded from this list. Since, as I mentioned in the preamble, those stories are just bigger than only the Justice League. This one is too, but to a much smaller degree. The real interesting aspect of this story is that it presents the Justice League without Superman, and that largely is the focus of this tale. Kal-El was missed by the Kent family after their truck ran over a nail on the day they would have found the infant. Instead, he was taken in by another family and never becomes a hero because of it. While the Justice League and all other events in history of DC canon are founded around that event, without a Superman to guide the League or the superheroes of this world. With similarities to Flashpoint, we learn how a simple, single nail can rewrite all of DC history. And in some ways, everything just sort of unravels without this figure there to hold everything together. Especially the way the story sort of makes everything else constant in terms of DC canon. So without Superman's presence in Metropolis, two key things change. First, Lex Luthor is left unchecked in the city, becoming the mayor at the start of the story. Second, he's able to use and rise to power by taking advantage of anti-metahuman sentiments, which, without Superman, Metropolis becomes a sort of hub for that type of hatred. Luthor, meanwhile, gets his hands on Kal's spaceship. Unchecked, he begins to use it for all sorts of crazy things and experiments, with some twist to that I won't give away here. The Justice League has to deal with becoming increasingly less popular thanks to Luthor, while he unleashes a conspiracy that will ultimately overrun the Earth. There's twists and caveats to this that really give this story a lot of fun color, while I think the writing behind it just sells everything in a spectacular way. The key to it all is it doesn't overplay its hand. A Superman-less world is indeed different, but not preposterously so. There are still heroes, the world is still largely protected and stable at the beginning of the story. What doesn't change are the things Superman would have specifically done. It feels like everything does sort of fall apart without Superman, but for organic reasons that don't simply lionize his character and make him the most important thing out there. It's a good story by Adam Davis and Mark Farmer, who would work together in making a sequel to this miniseries called Another Nail. I'm much more of a fan of the first over the second, which presents a different and fun story but doesn't quite live up to the fun of the first, which is just so great at presenting an alternate universe that's genuinely interesting. There's a lot of creativity here, just look at this world's version of Crypto. The Nail goes to a pretty dark place while still being an enjoyable and fun read overall. It feels like a big story focused on the DC universe while also featuring a ton of appearances by other characters and factions to make this world seem truly massive. But it is, at its core, a great Justice League story. I thought there was going to be no tomorrow. I thought my family and I were going to die. Then I saw them, and I saw tomorrow. I heard someone call them the world's greatest superhumans, but they're not that. Every civilization throughout history has had higher beings they aspire to. They are beings of great power and morality. Beings that help us strive for the better. They make me believe in tomorrow. For us, our families, and the rest of the world. They are the world's greatest superheroes. So, if you know the Justice League, you should know this one, because it's pretty straightforward on the whole. Justice League War and the comic it is based on, Justice League Origins, are my absolute favorite origin story for the Justice League. This really is everything the live action movie should have been, and everything it kind of wasn't. From an artistic perspective, this is one of the best drawn Justice League comics out there, with a beautifully perfect introduction of the team, trying out their powers and learning about each other, while also kicking off the New 52 in a big way and the new canon for DC. The New 52 and their take on the Justice League was never going to be perfect, but Geoff Johns wrote a lot of great stories for them, a few of which nearly got onto this very competitive top 10. This was the best among them, the start of something that ultimately I found never was quite exciting as this particular story. The time jump that takes place immediately after this sort of ruins all the excitement and optimism of this new team first working together. Nevertheless, we would go on to great things. As I said earlier, Forever Evil and Darkseid War are both strongly contended to make it onto this top 10. Yet only Origins, and in reality, War, are making it onto this list. It's a real solid look at how the Justice League would be viewed if something like this happened in real life. This last page from the comics, I think, really speaks to that. This story and what takes place here would have been a massively transformative incident for this world. The first ever alien invasion of this Earth, and at the hands of the devastating forces of Darkseid. All the more reason for the time jump to have been ultimately unwanted. But they didn't want to totally expel the Batman and Green Lantern canon either, so this is the sort of compromise we were forced to arrive at. And the only reason that I'm giving this to the movie over the comic is I think the movie just does a really good job at not only adapting the source material, but adding things here and there to it. It's really fun to see this all animated and playing out, and on the whole, the studio behind it did a really great job at producing Geoff Johns and Jim Lee's incredible comic. But don't get me wrong, Origins very much belongs here too, and it's kind of giving it to both of these stories. Not only are they very similar to one another, but they are both just excellent. This is the only animated movie to make it on here, indeed the only piece of media outside of the comic books, so it's a huge achievement on their part. There's a lot of other great animated Justice League movies out there and television shows, but none of them quite have the dynamic, exciting aspects of stories like this and the other ones we're going to be talking about. Also, it's a bit of a small point, but we're 3 comics in and Starro has appeared in all of them in some form or another. There's a reason for that. Starro was the very first enemy of the Justice League and their first story featured in The Brave and the Bold. Gardner Fox and Mike Sekowsky created that issue. It's a great start to a new era in DC history that very nearly got a spot in this video. But things sort of escalate in terms of quality over time. As such, though it definitely deserves recognition, it's a simple fact that over the years, content has simply been improved over time. The Justice League stands shocked at what has just unfolded. Batman has been secretly keeping files on all of them, in the event any of them ever became a threat. The Dark Knight's enemy, Ra's al Ghul, stole these plans, using them against the League while he attended to his own sinister purposes. The League is divided on what to do about this. The Martian Manhunter, Kyle Rayner, and Wally West vote to keep Batman on their team. Aquaman, Plastic Man, and Wonder Woman vote for expulsion. The deciding vote rests on the closest thing Batman has to a friend on the team. But before Superman gives his answer, it appears the Dark Knight already knows the results. So I love Tower of Babel. It's one of the first stories I thought of for this top 10. It's a great idea that would have effects on DC canon for years to come, if its effects aren't still felt to this present day, which I think they are. A new introduction of a concept that would create a realistic division in the League, and a consistent behavior in Batman that we'd see to this day. It's the best part of this story. It feels like it's true to the characters in question. Some of them readily accept or understand why Batman did what he did. Others, like Aquaman, Superman, or Plastic Man, simply can't accept it. Each of them have their own feelings and opinions on the subject, and I find the whole issue and story around it intensely interesting. There's a real serious question to be asked here, and it's a conflict I'm glad hasn't been fully resolved by the League, because I think this is a DC equivalent to Marvel's Superhero Registration Act, an actual dilemma that divides the Justice League in a very organic way. My problem is that the story lasts about 3 issues. It's a cool idea, one of the best that anyone's ever come up with in terms of Justice League content, but on its own it doesn't dwell on any of it. The story has gotten a full animated film made about it called Justice League Doom, which would have been a great opportunity to dig into stuff more, but in the end, it doesn't either. It barely dwells on any of this stuff at all. Ra's uses Batman's plans to mess with the League and enact a plan, but it is just as quickly foiled when the rest of the League is saved. There's a cool aspect of that where Batman didn't account for one of the newer members of the League and all that stuff, but by itself it really isn't all that exciting, and in comparison, Forever Evil, which very nearly made this top 10, digs into this concept way better than the Tower of Babel. But I like this story. Forever Evil simply wouldn't exist without the Tower of Babel either. Mark Waid and Howard Porter absolutely nail this comic, however short these 3 issues might be. The compromise I finally arrived at, or what makes this story truly remarkable and definitely worth being on here at the same level as everything else, is by including Divided We Fall, the 8 issues that follow Tower of Babel. The end result is these 11 issues that not only follow up on Tower of Babel, but really dig into the fallout of Batman not only leaving, but being expelled by the League. It feels like everything just sort of falls apart right away because of this. After getting into this foray with magic, which kind of needed Batman's help anyways, it becomes clear that the whole League just doesn't trust each other anymore because of what Batman did. They start bickering with each other while they're working on missions and stop acting like a team. Superman confronts Batman about it and it kind of feels warranted. Like it or not, the Dark Knight created this division and may very well have ruined the greatest superhero team on Earth, the first line of defense against danger. And, on the other hand, I really understand where Batman is coming from, and he really is justified in doing what he does half the time in this story. He's also genuinely hurt by what Clark did by voting against him, and there's something to that. This feels like we verge on the breaking point for the Justice League, and I sort of love it for that reason. A lot of these other stories on this top 10 video are going to be about iterations of this team coming together, them being at their best, and being able to face their worst challenges because of it. They are strong stories of teamwork and character relationships in a more positive direction. But sometimes there's a lot to learn and appreciate from everything going horribly wrong, especially when there isn't a single beat of the story that feels forced. That last part is critical in keeping things from descending into pointless melodrama. Things get really bad in these comics. Harsh words are said, old issues resurface. It has happened before where the team gets divided or is simply not functioning. But this is my absolute favorite. Batman destroys something in the team that can't be fixed, and even with expulsion, they don't trust each other anymore. And that change in dynamic hasn't really happened on a level in the Justice League quite like this before or since. It feels like Bruce's own inability to trust others, beyond even his planning for their possible betrayal, cuts this league in half. It soon becomes clear that this is beyond just Batman creating these contingency plans. He wasn't treating the team like friends. He wouldn't tell them anything about himself, and he wasn't willing to fully trust any of them, not even Superman. And it ultimately broke the team. So even if Batman was kind of justified in creating these contingency plans, and I would argue pretty strongly that he is, there's a reason he's being confronted and called out over all of this. And in some ways, those that are against these contingency plans do have a point, because what inevitably was going to happen is exactly what happened. Evil people get a hold of these plans, and they ultimately are what can be used against the League in the first place. So there's a real dilemma here that isn't easily solved. The way this story ends is a bit simple and obvious based on what we've just kind of gone over, but it's a real phenomenal moment. It's not only moving, but gives this story a real sense of closure, even if, to this day, the wounds opened up here haven't really fully healed or been addressed. And for good reason. I like that this is an issue that could theoretically crop up again. Divided We Fall becomes critical to making Tower of Babel a truly great Justice League story. It not only deals with the fallout of it, but it also resolves the conflict that the Tower of Babel presents. It doesn't rush through things, but it is about the League almost falling apart and finding a way back together. As this story goes on, Brian Hitch would also become involved in writing the final few issues. He closes out one of my favorite stories from any Justice League comic, as well as one of the most famous. This story is deeply influential, with only a handful of others topping it. Seriously, most people who know something about Justice League will probably know something about this story. It's also a great reminder that this team is always composed of both ideologues and realists, vigilantes and superheroes. Dealing with this conflict in such an excellent way, in the dichotomy between the two approaches that these types of superheroes have, Mark Waid does something incredible in these two story arcs that leads to some of the best storytelling in Justice League history. It's by far my favorite part in Mark Waid's time with the Justice League, and features a lot of great artists throughout the entire run, especially the 50th issue that takes place halfway through Divided We Fall. And it all stems from a specific series of Justice League comics that we aren't actually done talking about anytime soon. And we won't be for a very long time. We stand today on the edge of a new frontier. The frontier of the 1960s. The frontier of unknown opportunities and perils. The frontier of unfilled hopes and unfilled threats. Beyond that frontier are uncharted areas of science and space. Unsolved problems of peace and war. Unconquered problems of ignorance and prejudice, unanswered questions of poverty and surplus. DC The New Frontier is a series of comics written and drawn by Darwin Cook. He does some really amazing stuff here. First of all, his art has a very cool look to it. Though quite cartoony and simplistic, it often reveals a lot of emotion and is pitch perfect for the story and tone in question. A bright and optimistic take on the superheroes emerging in the Golden Age, but published and written in 2004, with an appropriate sense of hindsight and understanding of that era, beyond simple and naked nostalgia. It's by far my favorite depiction of the Justice League in this early era of Golden and Silver Age comics, even though it wasn't actually published from that period. Because, when compared to those comics and Justice League type stories from that era, none of which actually do feature on this top 10, this one feels a lot more honest and even-handed, benefiting from the clarity of hindsight while also representing and embracing the spirit of the era. So it features parts of this time period at its best while also reconciling with the worst. Add to that the fun and excitement of new heroes emerging with solid characters on the whole. This is a real personal favorite of mine. It's one of the best examples of the Justice League at the best. They are as much a symbol and an ideal as they are a team of superheroes. When we dig into this lofty and ambitious aspect of the Justice League, The idea of them representing the best of humanity, these superheroes soaring above us, protecting us, leading us, and being this true source of inspiration, is this comic and a handful of others that really come to mind. There was an animated adaptation of this, but it is a lot simpler in design and scope. The original comic is far better, even if I enjoyed the animated movie, and it was my introduction to the comic proper. But I understand people aren't as big a fan of the movie as they are the comic, and I can't help but agree with them. The comic is definitely the superior model, though the animated movie does get two things most important to the comic right: the spirit and optimism of the era shining through, along with the unique and wonderful look of this mini-series. If you haven't read this one, I do recommend it because it's a real treat. Plans were drawn and metal mined. The first foundation stone laid. Green lights flickered as girders and scaffolding stretched out in the shape of 3 dimensions. And pylon by pylon, rampart by rampart, with liquid crystal windows and walls of promethium, the structure rose. Perimeter fortress, first line of defense, the Justice League Watchtower. Plus it comes with a really nice view. Grant Morrison wrote a series of Justice League of America comics which shows up more than any other series on this top 10, including the aforementioned Tower of Babel and Divided We Fall, which is the same series as this one. When we talk about a legacy, there's nothing that compares to the JLA comics that premiered in 1997. In fact, by far, this era of Justice League comics is the ones that show up the most on this top 10. I try not to be too biased in that regard, but it's really hard to escape the fact that there's just some really strong and deeply influential periods of Justice League comics during this time in DC history. Everything about New World Order sets things up so well, and it has a lot going for it right out of the gate with a new series. Perhaps a bit too much. It's almost overwhelming how much happens in this comic at once in the first few issues. But it's hard to get away from how influential this story is. Not only in what we think of when we think of the Justice League and who's on the team, but in introducing essential concepts like the Watchtower. A bit of a must-read for Justice League fans, and the start of some truly epic comics, including a couple others we'll talk about shortly, New World Order is easily one of the best ever created. Almost everything we're about to talk about wouldn't exist were it not for this story, and that's important to remember going forward. And it has a genuinely inspiring ending that gets into the core of what the Justice League is about. There's not much else to say because otherwise it's a pretty straightforward story. The Justice League fights off alien invaders and Grant Morrison is Grant Morrison, but boy does he do a great job at selling you on this new series. And if you think we're done talking about his time with the Justice League, you are mistaken. He says his name is Alexander Luthor. He is from the far side of the mirror. His Earth orbits its star in a counterclockwise direction. Here it is summer, there it is winter. He was born in an antimatter reflection of this world. Good is evil, and vice versa. Next up is a standalone graphic novel by none other than Grant Morrison, and with art by Frank Quitely. With this story, we are really getting into the heavy hitters of Justice League stories. Everything so far has been near perfect, but now we're truly broaching phenomenal stuff that stands out among my favorites. Frank Quitely's art took a bit for me to adjust to when it comes to how he draws people, but he does deliver in a big way once you're kind of used to it and on board. Even with facial expressions and emotions and how people and their body language are carried. Look at how the League encounters Luthor. The way that he creates this lighting effect is just perfect for the scene. Very simple, very obvious, but absolutely nailing it. Grant Morrison is Grant Morrison, and don't worry, I'm not done talking about him just yet. But boy does he have a lot of fun with this story. This is the first look at the Earth 2 villainous version of the Justice League post-Crisis of Infinite Earths. As a result, the whole thing is kind of a crazy big deal. We learn that though there still isn't a multiverse at this time period in DC history, there is an antimatter universe where the crime syndicate of America reigns supreme. What I love about this series is that it brings the crime syndicate robustly into the modern age, with some of the best people around in the business at the time working on this series and giving them a modern take not only welcome, but just totally awesome as well. It's a really fun read and an amazing graphic novel. I don't know if anyone does these big landscape panels better than Quietly. I can't stop staring at this take on Metropolis. It just is so detailed and so well done. The crime syndicate themselves are just perfect. This story would be influential in many other Justice League tales as well, such as Forever Evil or the animated movie Crisis of Two Earths. Owlman, Ultraman, and Superwoman, also known as Lois Lane, are all phenomenal characters in their own right. There's this brutal moment with Owlman I found so heart-wrenching, and I like how there is a distinct humanity for all these villains. Little things like their motto, Sui Bono, which is Latin for Who Profits, or Ultraman just dumping millions of dollars into the streets knowing that it'll mess around with the economy, go a long way in telling us who these characters are and what they are all about. Meanwhile, the Justice League, though not really challenged much as characters, internally, like they don't develop a lot, they're all on point and well portrayed. And yet the story feels all about the Justice League because we're looking at the mirror. We're looking at what would happen if they were villains, and they don't feel overpowered, but they do feel dangerous and interesting. It's a rare comic in that everything is just perfect for what it needs to be. It's not the deepest story in the world, but damn if it isn't stylish as hell. And yes, the story is fairly straightforward, but the characters aren't. They're all very interesting and compelling, both hero and villain. It's full of content that would make for the perfect recipe if it were ever adapted into something like a live-action film, were Warner Brothers ambitious enough to try something like this. Certain aspects of this, at this point, are a little dated. Earth 2 Jimmy Olsen is apparently a crossdresser simply to make a joke at one point, for example. But it doesn't change the simple fact that this is one of my favorite comics, an absolute work of art, and an amazing moment in Justice League history. The new Justice League is off to a rough start. Everyone but Batman and the Martian Manhunter are new, and Guy Gardner isn't too interested in taking orders. When the others try and get the Green Lantern to back down, he lashes out, attacking his would-be teammates. A brawl quickly unfolds, and Dr. Fate prepares to easily put an end to it, but Batman insists he handle it alone. The others quickly back down as the Dark Knight approaches the Green Lantern, uttering a simple command to Guy Gardner. Sit down. And with that, the first meeting of Justice League International begins. The first outing proves difficult though, as many of the team have their faults, while Gardner is consistently chafing at Batman's leadership. At one point, at their headquarters, Gardner insists that he become the new leader of the team. Gardner takes off his ring and threatens the hero to fight him man on man. The unique circumstances of DC immediately after the Crisis of Infinite Earths led to this story. Keith Giffen was asked not to include Superman, Wonder Woman, or The Flash, as they were all in the midst of being rebooted following the Crisis of Infinite Earths. Batman was given to Giffen out of sheer pity by Danny O'Neill, while the creative team behind this comic started embracing the off-kilt nature of them, choosing not to feature Hal Jordan, relying on the lesser-known Guy Gardner, and only bringing Martian Manhunter back from a past Justice League roster. Everyone else was new to the team, including characters brand new to DC itself, such as Blue Beetle. This is the earliest story in terms of when it was published out of this top 10, but one of the first that I thought of and definitely deserves to be here. It is a great and deeply influential comic, not just in terms of that all-time legendary punching moment, but in how it affected and developed characters in fun and interesting ways. Captain Marvel, now known as Shazam, no longer had a dual identity. Instead, the hero had the personality of the little boy that he represents. Guy Gardner and Booster Gold were also made a lot more fun, given the current personalities that we associate with these characters. Kevin Maguire's art sold the whole thing. There's a sense of realism, so it delivers a lot on facial expressions, while also being wonderfully dynamic and creative in design. There's a lot of cool characters that become the focus of this series to the extreme benefit of the story itself. This is still one of the best ways to learn more about DC canon beyond the obvious and well-known characters, and it is still a deeply entertaining and funny read on the whole, even though it's over 3 decades old at this point. Aside from some fashion and design choices, it doesn't feel dated whatsoever. It's also a nice lesson that the Justice League means more than the core characters commonly associated with the team. Yeah, this only includes about 2 or 3 characters commonly associated with the Justice League, but that doesn't matter because they're still the Justice League, and this story sells you on that. The fact that we don't have any of the major characters around gives this story a real underdog element to it, making it compelling and having a completely different feel to every other story on this top 10. It's rare to find a story this well written, funny, and clever in any superhero team, but especially in an ongoing series. Though only the first 6 issues are technically included here on the top 10, they are the start to a phenomenal series, and everything up to issue 22 was a solid contender for a spot on the top 10. Justice League International is an essential story that holds up profoundly well for what it is. This is a personal favorite of mine that I think any Justice League fan would love to read for themselves. Imagine a world transformed, a humanity beyond even our wildest imaginations. If our lives and the struggles we face were able to purchase that future, how could we not be grateful for the opportunity to fight for that possibility, that tomorrow? Perhaps, Alfred, perhaps one day humanity, or what humanity will become, will look back at this time and see the beginning of change, of transforming into something greater. Perhaps they'll see a new perspective, a new fearlessness, even when faced with a fight we would never choose. Or perhaps nothing would happen. But I can hope, can't I? I can hope that this will not have been all for nothing, because I see it in the lives of the Justice League. I see it in the lives of my friends. Next up is another lofty, idealistic Justice League story, and a great example of what the team is sort of all about. Doug Braithwaite and Alex Ross's art is a huge selling point of this comic. It reminds me a lot of Marvel's, both in design of the story and look, a series painted by Alex Ross as well. The similarities are likely quite intentional, and I think both stories work for the exact same reasons. While this story is often compared to Kingdom Come, as it also features Alex Ross's artwork, and to be honest, that comparison isn't terrible either. The comic looks good and sort of elevates itself to an incredible thing all on its own. There are very few comics out there where the art tops everything else to me, to the extent that I feel if we could strip away all the dialogue and writing in this series, it would still be amazing. It would still probably be a solid contender for this top 10. Because the art is that jaw-dropping. Every panel, every single one is the sort of thing that would make for an amazing framed picture. It just looks so good. Especially in some superhero comic. Even by Alex Ross standards, this is a phenomenal work of art on the whole. Meanwhile, the whole point of this story is kind of the point of the team to begin with. The Justice League forms around the need for these heroes to work together after facing a threat they simply cannot fight on their own. It's sort of the opposite of Divided We Fall, an affirmation of how important the Justice League is, and what these legendary characters mean to each other, what they stand for, and why they are so important. It's an interesting change. Divided We Fall. Batman is identified as being the man with no friends on the League outside of maybe Superman. Here, at the end of this series, he declares everyone on the Justice League his friend. And there's something about that I really like. On top of all that, this is some of the best moments for so many villains. Jim Krueger did a great work in writing things and keeping the story simple and relying on the vivid fun of the art. Better yet, we get to see so many great aspects of the DC universe and canon throughout this mini-series. It's polished to perfection from start to finish. The story feels second fiddle to the artwork, but it does so much to actually facilitate that artwork, giving Alex Ross the opportunity to paint these amazing moments. It's easily one of the absolute best Justice League comics ever made. 12 issues of pure golds that I cannot recommend enough. But when it comes to the Justice League, there's one story out there that I think truly beats it out. The pounding of my heart, the roaring of my blood, the weight of muscles and bones, and the terrible knowledge that something, somewhere, has gone wrong. That was how I got here. It was the same for the others. We seem to have taken possession of the bodies of our future selves. It takes a little getting used to. 15 years. That's all it took. Rock of Ages is a story written by Grant Morrison and illustrated by Howard Porter. And here are the reasons why this story kicks ass. Howard Porter really is one of the best Justice League artists out there, perhaps only second to Alex Ross, but even then, Porter contributed a lot more to this team specifically. This comic also has an amazing story to back that artwork up. It's full of cool ideas and great looking moments. It's fun having Blue Superman around in a big Justice League story from that particular era. Luthor also has a very cool role in all of this, as does the Joker, before the real villain behind the story is revealed in a big way, because this is all kind of about Darkseid. He's a force, and the whole setup of the plotline makes him this sort of consistent and pretty interesting threat. The Justice League, which by now, compared to the New World Order days, only a handful of issues previous to this story, has had its roster changed ever so slightly. Even then, it has some really great character moments, including one great bit between Batman and Robin. It's a nice glimmer into Batman's life in conjunction with the Justice League, which is something often overlooked in Justice League stories. Similarly, we get a good glimpse into Superman and Lex Luthor and their dynamic together. It's a really cool aspect of Grant Morrison's time with the Justice League. He tends to look beyond just the characters being on this team, including their lives outside of this team in important ways, and giving each a member of the team these cool, individualized character moments. But there's so much more to the story itself, including an alternate future that makes Darkseid so cool. Having seen Darkseid go up against the Justice League quite a few times by now, it really is interesting coming back to this story and seeing him be such a strong force without things spiraling out beyond the Justice League itself. The alternate timeline allows us to focus just on these characters in a very cool way. Widely considered one of Grant Morrison's best when it comes to the Justice League, and obviously I'm inclined to agree. The combination of cool, unique writing and imagery makes this one of the best Justice League stories ever crafted. To this day, there really isn't anything else out there like this. It's a great balance of action and those classic Grant Morrison mind-blowing moments that he's famous for. It's the ending that really sticks with me. I'm not sure how or why this exactly beats out Justice. Alex Ross's art is straight up better than Howard Porter's if you ask me. But when I reread this thing for my top 10 and got to that ending, it just hit me. I was already aiming for this to be the number one, and after rereading this story, I feel more strongly about that now than ever before. The way Grant Morrison was able to give each character these interesting little moments and bits at the end of the arc, the way he resolved things, leaves you so excited for just reading the rest of this series and Grant Morrison's time with the Justice League, is just perfect. Here's a good example of what really sells me on this story. Superman realizes Luthor actually did some stuff near the end of this story to save a lot of people, and approaches him to basically thank the man. Luthor, who, well, by now had reached the sort of complicated status of modern Lex Luthor, was still very much a villain and denied everything. Then they have this little exchange. "Goodbye, Lex. There's a good man in there somewhere." You think so, do you? It's a little exchange like that, coupled with the crazy imagination this writer always seems to have, that makes Rock of Ages my all-time favorite Justice League story. And that's not even a controversial statement. This is the choice for a lot of other people, fans, and critics out there. I checked out of curiosity. I looked around. Most people identify Rock of Ages as their Justice League story, more than any other comic or story out there as far as I can tell. I'm just having trouble identifying exactly why that is, why we all think this way. Because I think objectively, Justice is better. It involves a more traditional Justice League, it involves a lot of their villains in a fun way, the artwork is just gorgeous, but a few things just make Rock of Ages special. First, the plot and story hasn't been overused to oblivion. It's pretty unique and interesting, and though fairly complex, pays off even if you're not totally caught up on everything happening around this comic and series in terms of continuity. Its best moments are with characters you definitely already know anyways, even if they're kind of doing different things from what we're used to. Blue Superman has his own set of powers and does his own little thing here, but I found it interesting. I didn't find myself missing the original Superman, it was cool to see him in this new setting. Couple that with what I think is just one of the straight up best Justice League artists ever, and if we're being honest, probably the best writer for the team too, and it all just sort of comes together into this perfect story. I don't like to say that comics are entirely subjective and whether or not you enjoy them can be rooted in subjectivity. There are firm objective things out there, things we can look at in art to determine their quality and how rushed they were, for example. Things in the story that are observable and objective, even in art. And while I think Justice, the story, is a superior product on the whole, the difference between objectivity and subjectivity is what makes Rock of Ages special. There's a reason why Morrison and Porter's series comes up when a lot of people talk about the Justice League. I think it sticks with people in this weird, subjective way. It's a bit dated by now, just in terms of artwork quality and design of characters. A lot of their look feels like a product of its era. But the best parts of this story holds up, and it leaves such an impact on me and other people. I kind of understand why Rock of Ages is so commonly cited as one of the best Justice League stories out there, even if there isn't an objective reason for it. At their core, the Justice League is kind of about this subjectivity. That's where stories like Justice itself and The New Frontier really shine. I think the subjectivity is where Justice League functions best, where it's more about idealism than about reality. Oh, and then at the end of the story, the team breaks up. So that's the end of the video. Thanks a lot for watching, and again, let me know how this camera's working out. I'm sure I'll hear about that from you guys in the comment section below, but also feel free to share some of your favorite Justice League stories out there. These obviously involve a lot of personal favorites of mine, so I'm sure there's other people's opinions out there, and those who feel I've missed something. Kingdom Come, I expect, is going to be a big one, but I will point out that, like I said, I just think it's a bigger story than just one involving the Justice League. But you might disagree, and feel free to share your opinion in the comments below. If you like Comic Island and you want to be involved in picking out topics like this video, then you should check out our Patreon page, because you can do so for only $1 a month. Finally, don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep reading comics.